a different number and a different identity to the network that says, here's Max. 60 seconds later, here's Max. So some timelines are really very short. So the one thing I'd sort of like you to take away for the moment from this is identity is a temporally unstable element, and that any identity has some probability p to exist at time t, and some probability q that it ceases to exist at some later date. Now, online identities are sort of a special instance of identity. You're already familiar with things like passwords. Passwords age. That makes reasonable sense. When we shop at a commercial website, we get a session ID that sort of dies at the end of our shopping visit. So you pick stuff, put it in the cart, it charges you for it, and that ID sort of dies. And another example is people may drop one digital identity and adopt another one in an online game, for example. So one day you're an orc, the next day you're an avatar swinging a sword, etc. Now, for example, here, people at the conference often use or create identities that are not linked to identities associated with them in various databases for usually pretty good reasons. So ask the question, why might an identity cease to exist? Well, maybe the individual disassociates them from the identity. That might be one thing. I don't want to be that anymore. Some entity forcibly disassociates the individual from the identity. You kick them off the channel, you whack their account, whatever it happens to be, you're gone. Or sometimes the identity will just sort of expire. Now, one good sort of devil's advocate question is, does an identity ever really cease? After you die, is your identity gone? No. I think, if somewhere there's some instance that remains either in the physical, the cyber, or memory, wetware world, then has that identity really ceased to exist? Well, I'm not really sure. That's a really good question. Don't have a good answer to it. Consequences of temporally unstable identities. Well, persistence of identity is important for InfoSec purposes. Authentication, authorization often require sort of time-stable identities, stuff that stays the same. And identity management architectures often rely on temporally stable identities. Stuff has got to stay stable over time, some reasonable time window. An exception to this is the RSA token, where it changes every 60 seconds, but you know that on some server somewhere, it's also changing every 60 seconds, and so you have some sort of parallel system somewhere matching your identity going out in time. So that's kind of an interesting exception. So what are some psychological consequences of temporally unstable identities? Well, if you look back in the old days, back in the old films and things like that, you often saw lots of references to, oh, what will happen to my reputation? And things like that, where people spent a lot of time, months, years, and decades, building reputations and hanging on to them. But now, with the digital revolution, we've accelerated the number and the pace at which these identities or reputations emerge and expire. That means that somehow, psychologically, we have to be able to tolerate this faster and more frequent identity change in order to sort of keep a sense of well-being. So you still go, gee, I really know who I am. It's cool. Yeah, if you don't do that, you may sort of lose some sense of identity or loss of self, and then you're not going to be sort of psychologically balanced. And so that could be sort of a bad thing. Let's move on to situational identity. Now, social scientists have long observed that lots of identities are sort of tied to situations. And it happens to appear a lot in the non-digital world. People hold and they change roles all the time. For example, you're a concert goer. You go to a Stevie Nicks concert. Or your father. Or you're an airline passenger. Well, that seems to be getting tougher to do these days. And situational identity in the digital world is much more rich, and it's much more complex. So for example, you might have a role as an orc battling a hero in a game, and then in another situation, a member of a hacking team in the middle of an IRC chat. And then in another situation, an employee logging on to their employer's network. So each situation, you have sort of a different identity. Now, there's kind of a problem with that. And one of the problems is these situational identities are most salient, are most evident to you when you're present in the situation. So often there's a lack of sort of communication between these situational identities. That is, you move out of one into the other, and it's a good thing because sometimes these identities don't coexist very well. And a good example of that is a person who's an information security employee by day and a member of a hacking group by night. Oops. And if they meet, well, that's not quite so good. It's a little tougher to sort of resolve. One example of someone who's sort of looked at identity as situational identity is Jordan, Hauser, and Foster. They designed what they called augmented social networks. Pretty interesting paper, pretty cool idea. It's based on 4 sort of basic principles. Principle number 1 is persistence of identity. If you have an identity, it's going to be stable for a while over time, and it's going to stay there. Number 2, interoperability between online communities. That is, they're talking about transferring identities from one online community to the other. And so that's got to be able to work. Number 3 is brokered relationships. That is, well, I trust Phil and Phil trusts Bill, so I trust Bill as well. And the idea here is if you trust a person in one area, you can trust them in another. So if I know someone who's a great C++ coder, I might trust that person to recommend a good book to read for fun, because I think they'll probably have a book that the same kind of interest that I will. It'll be pretty cool. The breakdown in this sort of identity transfer scheme often comes in this sort of interoperability assumption. For example, I have a very good friend who's a tremendously great researcher. She's really fabulous. Well, this idea of ASN says, well, you know what? Since she's a really competent, really great researcher and you trust her, you could probably trust her. Let's move that trust to another online community. Let's move it to eBay. And I go, well, I don't know about that, because I know her really well. I know that she's really bad at paying bills. She always has her cable shut off. She forgets to pay it. Often forgets to pay her insurance. She's basically a huge path of financial mayhem wherever she goes. And so I would never, ever, ever, even though I love her dearly, expect to buy something from her or sell something to her and expect to get paid. So this idea doesn't always work quite as well as you'd like it to. I think it's sort of a utopian kind of idea, a really nice concept, but when you really try and make it work, it often doesn't. Well, this suggests that in the digital world, large identity architectures that people are trying to build, like federated identity systems that rely to some degree on situational identities, authenticate and validate or grant privileges, may at some point get themselves into trouble as well. That is, the typical rules of I know something, I have something in terms of authentication just basically may not cut it in the end. Okay, next up. The other idea I want to talk to you about a bit is class versus unique identifiers. That is, things that identify you. Some things are unique identifiers. That is, there's sort of a one-to-one relationship between you and the identifier. And in theory, things like a national identity card, a fingerprint, DNA sample. Of course, now we know these aren't perfect. You could have an identical twin. The government could screw up and give your ID number to another person. But in general, they're pretty much unique identifiers. And then there's a second class of identifiers, that is class identifiers. This type of identifier associates actors belong to a class of individuals, a one-to-many relationship. So, for example, you're female. Okay, so you belong to the female class. There are lots of other females that do. You're a college graduate, lots of other college graduates. You're a bunny rabbit owner, maybe not too many of those, but there's some. User group other in Unix systems, and so you can belong to this sort of class identifier. Now, in the non-digital world, We'll just use these examples again: age and gender and college educated. Now, suppose you try to alter your identity. So, for example, try and alter your gender. You could put on some makeup and a dress if you're a guy, shave your legs, see what else you have to do. Oh, shave up here, yeah, this will have to go. And so you can try and sort of pass like that, but it's actually kind of tough. For example, I know someone who is a transgendered person. That is, they used to be a he, and now, after a lot of years in an operation, they're a she. But if you take DNA, she's still a he. So it's kind of tough to change. Things with age, you can try to look a little younger with age. Lots of women try to do that. A little makeup. College education, you can say, I went to this school. You may not have gone to that school, but you can look it up on the web and know a lot of facts about it, and you maybe actually just sort of try and pass it off, but you probably eventually kind of get caught. And same thing with unique identifiers. You have a passport, got mine here somewhere. It's kind of hard to forge. You can do it, but it's kind of hard. There are a lot of clues that say, you know, this kind of looks kind of funky. So bandwidth for information in this non-digital world is really pretty high. It makes it hard to alter and sort of maintain identities. And this creates sort of a gap between unique identifiers and class identifiers. It's pretty big. Now, let's move to the digital world. Let's take these same examples, age, and gender, and college educated. For example, gender can be altered with just a nickname change, and away you go. I'm no longer Henry, I'm Heidi. Age can be altered in an explicit statement. I'm 14 years old. Or you can, college education be explicitly claimed and backed by some background. Gee, I went to Stanford. The farm is really great. The farm is a nickname for the campus. I really like Mem Chu. It's really beautiful. That's the name of the memorial church. If you drop enough clues, people will go, oh, for sure, went there. Other things, bank account numbers, social security numbers, user passwords. There's not a lot of bandwidth to say, you know, something doesn't quite match. Something's not quite coherent here. And coherence is actually one of the things that profilers use a lot in determining sort of like what's going on, who this person might be, et cetera. So it's a lot harder to sort of change because the bandwidth's a lot lower. And so the gap between class identifiers and unique identifiers is a lot smaller in the online world. So you can create identities in the digital world. You can use cover information. For example, create a website with information consistent with the digital identity you want to adopt. The search engine crawls your website, like Google, picks it up the information, indexes it. Someone Googles you, and they say, oh, look, Google says this guy went to Stanford, and he has a patent, and he's a world's greatest dancer or something like that. So there's a lot of stuff that you could put up there. Now, the use of limited bandwidth, you can also control or conceal telltale identity markers. For example, in the FBI Innocent Images program, which is a program that's used to entice sex offenders online, FBI agents portray 14-year-old girls. And in fact, 14-year-old girls teach the FBI agents how to be 14-year-old girls, how they talk, what they think, how they act, etc. In fact, one thing I left out is when I had this nice sort of conversation with a gentleman here. I do this in a lot of my talks. One warning, never do this with an armed FBI agent. It does not work. It really scared the shit out of me. He wouldn't move, and he stared at me like this, like, oh God, he's gonna shoot me or something. I don't know. So anyway. Okay, let's look at one other dimension of identity. Deterministic versus probabilistic identifiers. Now, deterministic identifiers are characteristics or pieces of yourself that are known with sort of a high degree of sort of certainty. You're female, My age is 24.